Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Future Morality, edited by David Edmonds, narrated by Shaun Grindell and Gabrielle Baker. Editor's Preface. There are scientific, medical, and technological breakthroughs that are likely to happen, but that have not happened yet. As a result, there are ethical issues that we can predict are likely to occur, but that we do not, at the moment, face. I have always been fascinated by such topics, and I have long been skeptical that our instinctive intuitions about new moral dilemmas should be relied upon. To take just one example, Louise Joy Brown was born on the 25th of July, 1978, the first human conceived by in vitro fertilization. At the time, the pioneering scientists behind IVF were heavily criticized by the medical establishment and by the church. The Brown family received a deluge of hate mail. Since then, millions of children have been born through IVF, and within most circles, IVF has long ceased to be controversial. It now seems odd that it was ever contentious. Thinking philosophically about fresh ethical dilemmas can help us distinguish between developments that we should welcome and those that we need be concerned about. And in some areas, there are steps we could be taking now to prevent problems occurring in the future. This book is an attempt to get to grips with some of the ethical issues confronting our rapidly changing world. I have divided it into several somewhat arbitrary categories: future people, future lives, future machines, future communication, future bodies, and future death. It is by no means a comprehensive list of future moral dilemmas, but I hope it offers a useful snapshot. The book includes questions such as whether we should seek an alternative to meat, whether social relationships of the future, especially friendship, will be very different from those of today, whether in the future artificial intelligence will help us to identify criminals, and whether AI will eventually make human doctors redundant. One chapter examines whether it might be possible to shape persuasive technologies, those that are designed to change our attitudes and actions, so that they work for us and not against us. Another asks what can be done about the rise of fake news and conspiracy theories, now spreading and proliferating in our digital world. In the future, we may have the power to read minds, to create artificial wombs, to improve humans and livestock genetically, so that both humans and livestock are less susceptible to disease. Technological advance seems to promise progress and improvement to our lives. Is there a downside? Then there's a section on death. Machines can now keep us functioning at some level for longer than before. In fact, new technology is already forcing us to reconsider what counts as death and what's valuable about life. How far should we go to avoid death? A chapter on cryonics asks whether there's any point in freezing our bodies in the hope that one day we might be resuscitated. And we end with a chapter that questions whether what we should really be concerned about is not human future, but the future of post-humans. William Shakespeare has the Roman nobleman Cassius tell Brutus in Julius Caesar that destiny is not in the stars, but in ourselves. A similar thought is the motivating impulse behind this book. The history of human existence has been a history of scientific and technological development. We should assume that discoveries and innovations will continue to be made, almost certainly at a faster pace than ever before. But we have the power to sculpt the future, and the earlier and more clear-sighted we are about our options, the more malleable that future will be. Future people. 1. Future versus present morality. Hazem Zoni. Is this book moral? This is not a confused query about the book's personality or behavior. It's about the time and attention that went into it. Time and attention that could have been differently used. The future, after all, is uncertain. The present, dire. Shouldn't ethicists focus primarily on the latter? Let's express this sentiment along these lines. Ethicists are a scarce resource. The present is ethically fraught. The richest 1% own over half the world's wealth. Hundreds of thousands of children die each year from malnutrition. Millions live in slavery or as forced labourers. The future, on the other hand, is unknowable, and the impacts of emerging technologies like AI, cryonics, gene editing, and mind-reading devices largely unforecastable. Surely ethicists should focus their attention on the present rather than on future hypotheticals. We can call proponents of this view presentists. In response, those we'll call anticipators might say, in fact, ethicists aren't a scarce resource. Nearly anyone can do ethics, as opposed to, say, brain surgery. Moreover, present problems like inequality are political, not moral. Ultimately, a failure to anticipate moral problems would render the future far worse than the present. Who is right, presentists or anticipators? The unexciting conclusion that both reflect some truth seems inescapable, but I'd like to suggest there is a lot to be said for presentists, and for the claim that this book, and the way ethicists have been allured by future visions, is a little bit morally bad. This is because questions of distributive justice, or justly allocating resources, are relevant to what ethicists focus on. And ethicists, especially the applied variety who appeal to the implications of moral theories or principles for specific situations, have been overly preoccupied by the promises and perils of emerging and future technologies. Specifically, while applied ethicists readily delve into the science behind AI, gene editing, brain-machine interfaces, nanotech, etc., they have not bothered learning much about economic theories and the conflicting values and difficult trade-offs directly raised by economic policy. Why this contrast with economics? Economics is about what is produced, distributed, and consumed. It fundamentally affects the ethical implications of all goods, including technological ones. It is ironic, therefore, how little attention applied ethicists afford it. This claim about how applied ethicists generally focus their energies is an empirical one, and no study yet exists to vindicate it. But at the time of writing, it is easy to see how applied ethicists author the most relevant of the 3.8 million results Google Scholar provides for human enhancement, but virtually none of the 3.1 million results for moral economics. Output on human enhancement outstrips poverty ethics, 1.7 million, preventable disease ethics, 100,000, discrimination, 2.3 million, and even abortion, 1.4 million. Even a subtopic like moral enhancement, 460,000, dwarfs output on preventable disease ethics. This Google Scholar survey is not, of course, meant to stand in for scholarship, and we should be extra cautious about reading too much into these figures, as there is no clear dividing line between applied ethicists and other experts. Nonetheless, the numbers are indicative of a disproportionate focus on the future in what occupies those working on the ethics of concrete issues. This book is yet further evidence of this tendency. There may be many reasons for this trend, some of them obvious. Technologies that might enhance, say, our moral dispositions are simply more interesting to think about than preventable diseases in the world. But another reason, especially when it comes to economic matters, is that applied ethicists largely relegate the ethics of economics to economists or political philosophers, where libertarians, socialists, and those in between fight it out by appealing to large, abstract principles or assumptions about things, like the proper role of the state. But this is akin to relegating the ethics of emerging technologies to scientists or historians and philosophers of science. There is an asymmetry here, and it's a neglected one. The scarcity of ethicists. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's begin with the anticipator's retort that ethicists are not a scarce resource. Most mentally intact adults can indeed appeal to reason to answer ethical questions, and typically do so repeatedly throughout their lives. If anything, a scroll through social media suggests an overabundance of people espousing reasons for ethical stances. In contrast, few have any clue about, say, brain tumor removal. We would rightly tell our non-brain surgeon friend to be quiet if they had strong opinions about the specifics of a relative's impending brain surgery. But we might, in contrast, hear them out if, over dinner, they explain why they are vegetarian, unless they are being infuriating about it. On the other hand, a trained ethicist is presumably better than average at justifying an ethical stance, or presenting an ethical argument. They are more likely to take the time to learn the relevant empirical backdrop to ethical problems, to uncover hidden premises, and perhaps to adopt a healthy skepticism towards certain intuitions. More crucially, an ethicist is trained to make their arguments on the basis of claims that most reasonable people can appreciate, as opposed to idiosyncratic, religious, or other evidence-free claims. Ultimately, it comes down to this. Relatively few people are paid to be ethicists. The position ethicist is clearly a scarce one. Just ask anyone trying to get a job at a philosophy department. If only a tiny minority can be paid to think about and offer resolutions to ethical problems, some justification seems required for what they will focus on. And so we should ask whether focusing on the future to the current extent is a good use of that position. Presentists are therefore right about their first claim. Ethicists are a scarce resource. Let's award them 1 point. Presentists 1, anticipators 0. Present problems. What about the second claim that the present is fraught with pressing problems? Are the failures of our political and economic systems moral problems? That is, ones arising from disagreement over how to ethically resolve them? Or do these failures merely reflect an insufficient number of political decision-makers supporting the obvious ethical path forward? In other words, are these ethics problems or political will problems? It might be tempting to side with anticipators, that the most pressing problems at present are political rather than ethical. Most ethicists might agree that, of course, current concentrations of wealth are ethically unjustifiable. Of course it is immoral so many are malnourished, while over 1 billion tons of food are wasted each year. And of course slavery and forced labour are abhorrent and should be stopped. There are no moral dilemmas here, no conflicting values. These are problems for politicians and global institutions, not ethicists. And the same holds for other big crises of our times, like climate change, authoritarianism, poverty, and preventable disease. These reflect failures of political will, not moral disagreement. This, however, is a cop-out. Merely agreeing that much of the status quo is not morally justifiable is as vague and inane as noting that, if emerging technologies have a really bad impact, that would be morally bad. Clearly, there's a lot more to be said. Applied ethicists, generally, take the time to understand the science and limitations behind these emerging technologies before analysing in detail the values at play, the conflicts between them, and the trade-offs entailed by the manner of embracing or rejecting them. For instance, the possibility of genetically enhancing children has led applied ethicists to draw battle lines between reproductive freedom and prospective children's autonomy, with small libraries being written on what autonomy even means in such contexts, what the risks of banning these technologies are, for example, might black markets for them emerge, and what the merits of genetic enhancement might be. In contrast, far fewer applied ethicists take the time to understand economic theories or policies and their political backdrops in order to formulate new or more cogent arguments in response to the most pressing present problems. In fact, mitigating inequality, malnutrition, slavery, preventable disease, or poverty does entail promoting or protecting some values at the expense of others, especially when asking how exactly to ethically tackle these problems. Just how much state or interstate coercion should be used to redistribute wealth, and what exactly are the trade-offs between what we value, or ought to value, in terms of equality and liberty. And what do we do when the empirical data about inequality, or the effects of mitigating it, are unclear? Similarly for malnutrition and modern slavery. how do we weigh the trade-offs entailed by reordering state spending to have the resources necessary to track and tackle these, and whose burden that ought to be? These are normative questions that are as applied as things can get, but they continue to be largely left to political philosophers, who tend to focus on how things ideally should be, or policymakers who aren't trained to think systematically about the ethical implications of their policies. Which is all to say, applied ethicists have a lot to offer in moving economic ethics forward. But, with some exceptions, they remain largely either uninterested or unable to get the funding to expand onto that turf. But seeing as it's our economic and political systems that will set the path for how future technologies unfold, it seems applied ethicists should be giving economics far greater attention. To that end, I think presentists deserve a further point. Presentists 2, anticipators 0. Forecasting futures. What about the third claim presentists make? That future technologies are largely unforecastable, so best focus on the present. Anticipators face a problem here as well, sometimes called the Unabridged dilemma. While controlling the impact of technologies is easier at their earlier stages, it is precisely at those early stages when we lack the necessary knowledge to beneficially influence the course they take. We simply cannot tell what final shape the technology will take, how it will be deployed, or how people will react to it. One way to resolve this is to enhance our forecasting abilities, to basically beat the Unabridged dilemma. There is much to be said for such an endeavour, but first I want to suggest that, even if we are mostly hopeless at predicting specific technological trends, anticipators' interest in the future can be important to the present in at least 3 ways. The first is this. Scientific research is itself a scarce resource. To minimize the chances of squandering it, we need some anticipation of its ethical implications. If the implications are clearly unethical, we should prioritize researching something else. Of course, how far into the future we need to venture to anticipate the effects of current scientific research is a key question, but it's worth conceding that at least some assessment of future impact is required. The second relates to a side effect of anticipatory ethics. Evaluating the ethics of a future prospect often brings us back to the present. Take the idea of powerful cognitive enhancement drugs in the classroom. Should they be allowed? Aside from side effect concerns, answering this question requires thinking about the purpose of education, of medicine, and of what, if anything, is inherently different about a drug compared to an external device, like a calculator or a word processor. So we might ask whether education is unavoidably competitive, helping ensure the best students get the best jobs. If so, these drugs might lead to a cognitive arms race. What would that entail? And if education is competitive, should it be? And should physicians prescribe these drugs? Or would that violate the proper scope of medicine, since they would not be used for treating or preventing disease? What exactly is the purpose of physicians? By triggering these questions, the mere prospect of these drugs leads us to re-evaluate the purpose of present institutions and norms in a new light. A valuable exercise, even if these drugs never materialize. Similarly, consider publicly funding a research project on the ethics of generation spaceships. These spaceships set out to colonize other planets, but the vast travel distances involve supporting not only those who first embark on them, but their descendants too. Is it permissible to have children in such a constrained domain, where life projects are limited and one is effectively imprisoned to a ship, and where passengers are coerced to procreate and work in areas deemed necessary for the success of the journey? Generation spaceships are no impending possibility, so why bother asking, let alone funding those asking these questions, instead of tackling presently pressing issues? But carefully considering these questions has huge implications for the generational spaceship we all currently inhabit. Earth, a rock also hurtling through space on which we are all stuck. Our intuitions about procreating on Earth, about what we owe others and how much sacrifice an individual should make for others, are often shackled by our over-familiarity with Earth. Contemplating possible, far-distant futures can help us to evaluate those intuitions anew. There is another way anticipating the future links back to the present. It may alter what we ought to presently value and invest in. This links to the first point raised about the scarcity of scientific research, but it goes much further. Take a school of thought called long-termism. Its premises go something like this. Given the average life of a species, 1 to 10 million years, with the right technology and forethought, it is reasonable to expect a huge number of future human generations, with a much larger number of people in each future generation. If we are impartial about our concern, the interests of future generations matter just as much as our own. We therefore have a strong duty to care very much about the future. Even if we reject that the interests of very distant future generations count as much as our own, it seems implausible that they do not matter at all. If it is reasonable to expect there to be many more people in the future than are currently alive, this has potentially radical implications for the present, including a far more heightened concern over existential threats like nuclear war or engineered pandemics. It shifts the question of how we ought to improve the present for us, or those soon to exist, to how we ought to improve the present to the benefit of those in the very long-term future. This still entails a focus on the present, albeit about what the present can do to promote or respect the likely far more numerous interests of future people. Which is all to say, even if we are fairly inept at forecasting technological trends, there is a lot to be said for thinking about the future anyway. It might be the only way we can get the present right. That's a big win for anticipators, so I think they deserve 2 points, bringing the score to 2-2. Implausible visions. This, however, is not the final tally. I suggested scientific research itself is a scarce resource, and that by not anticipating its ethical implications, we risk squandering it. But how far into the future do we need to anticipate the effects of a scientific investigation? Often this will be deeply uncertain. For instance, there were over 40 organizations in the world researching artificial general intelligence in 2017. This is AI that can reason across a wide range of domains, with the potential to master any intellectual task that a human can. It might be invented tomorrow, 100 years from now, or never. It likely has huge, world-rattling ethical implications, and so getting it right seems crucial. The question remains how to ascertain the plausibility of something like artificial general intelligence, or cryonics or artificial wombs, and how much of our time its implications should occupy relative to other issues. If ethicists focus on a technology that is unlikely to be realized any time soon, at the expense of present problems, or if they focus on an implausible vision of how that technology will likely be used, they risk squandering their efforts. So it seems that, while anticipators are justified in worrying about the future, something needs to be said about their methods of foresight. And yet, ethicists have so far neglected formulating or adopting any framework for what constitutes a plausible vision of a future technology. Instead, the typical methodology suffers from what's sometimes called an if-and-then syndrome. If technology X becomes available, then its consequences will demand immediate attention. This conditional statement can be enough to instigate an entire subfield of ethical inquiry about a hypothetical future technology. The problem, as scholars of science and technology studies keep reminding us, is that taking certain technological developments for granted fails to credit the interplay between science and society. Ethicists all too often think about an emerging technology in isolation, worrying about the implications of, say, radical life extension, while assuming that, if and when it is possible, that future will largely have the same economy, same population problems, and same values. But acknowledging this co-evolution of science and society requires taking into account myriad interacting socio-cultural, economic, political, and historical factors. an analysis which calls into question the relative value of much of the work anticipators do. Scholars in science and technology studies and the philosophy of technology have in fact developed numerous approaches to evaluating the plausibility of future technologies that recognize these indeterminate interacting factors. These published frameworks are variously called ethical technology assessment, anticipatory technology ethics, constructive technology assessment, and socio-technical scenarios, to name a few. All these methods are rooted in the idea that the assessment of a technological vision should explicitly acknowledge the complex and contingent nature of technological developments and their effects. And yet it remains rare to see ethicists worried about emerging technologies making use of these, let alone building on them or refining them. I think this warrants a further point for presentists. That leaves us with a concluding score of presentists 3, anticipators 2. It is an admittedly highly arbitrary score, but it reflects what I think should concern ethicists thinking about the future. There is indeed a distributive justice question about how ethicists focus their attention. Ethicists, especially the applied variety, have been neglecting the hugely pressing economic problems of our time, expending a lot of energy learning science, but not so much learning economics. And even though anticipating the future is crucial, not just for future people, but for the present, ethicists largely remain unconcerned with any systematic method for thinking about what makes those future visions plausible. It isn't the most sexy of topics, but there's a lot to be said for the ethics of doing ethics. I suggest ethicists have been not horrendous at this, but moderately bad. The point, therefore, of this chapter is to raise a question mark about the value of many of the subsequent chapters. Sorry.
2. How should we value the health of future people? Bridget Williams. Introduction. Alex is the medical director of a major hospital. She has just received a report that outlines the carbon emissions of the hospital's services and steps that could be taken to reduce them and move towards more environmentally sustainable healthcare services. It's possible for the hospital to implement these changes, but only by shifting focus and financial investment over the coming years away from other priorities. For example, plans for the expansion of certain patient services would be shelved and some existing services would have to be scaled back. Consequently, the quality of care offered by the hospital for the next few years would be worse than it could have been. The main reason to implement the report would be to reduce the risk of more severe climate change. Although there's evidence that climate change is already impacting health, the real benefits of dealing with climate change will come in the future. So Alex's dilemma is whether to reduce the care the hospital provides to the current population it serves for the sake of the health of the population in the future. How much weight should Alex give to the health of future people? The health of future people versus the health of people now. To determine whether and to what extent Alex should care about the health of future people, we must consider a prior question. Why does health matter at all? The World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. This definition positions health as well-being. The nature and value of health, and of well-being, is controversial. Philosophers have proposed several theories of both concepts, but for this chapter it will suffice to say that health is both intrinsically valuable, that is, valuable for its own sake, and instrumentally valuable, that is, valuable for what it allows us to do all the good things it brings us. It seems difficult to see how the intrinsic value of health would change.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?